So I'm going to spend the first hour this morning, talking about implicit or unconscious racial bias. But before I do that, I want to make clear that when I talk about unconscious bias, I am not in any way saying that we have moved beyond explicit conscious bias. We know that that exists as criminal defense lawyers. We're seeing it across the country now that we have someone in the White House who helps facilitate events like Charlotte. So I just want to say that the fact that I'm talking about unconscious bias says nothing about the continued prevalence of racial bias that's explicit, and Jeff will be talking about the history of that. Okay, so in order to understand unconscious racial bias and the way that it can influence all of us and others, we need to understand a little bit about the way our brains work. How do we process information? So take a look at this slide for a moment and raise your hand if you see Pac-Man. Oh, come on, Pac-Man. Remember that game, Pac-Man, right? That goes around. Okay, maybe this means that I'm older than most of you here, because Pac-Man is definitely on that screen. If I had a pointer, I would point to it. All right, that was just to warm you up. How many of you see triangles? Almost all of you. Circles? The Star of David? So most of you, if not all of you, saw triangles and the other shapes I mentioned, but those shapes don't actually exist on this slide. And yet what your brain does is it quickly, automatically, and unconsciously fills in the missing pieces. You can't help it. Your brain does it automatically. Just like if I were to show you some words and ask you not to read, you wouldn't be able to if you spoke the English language. Your brain would just read. That tells us something about the way our minds work. In order for us to pay attention, conscious attention, to things that we believe are important, our brains are like information processors, and they do things in the background while we are unaware of it. For instance, when you all came in today and sat down in your chairs, I bet none of you thought about the object that you're sitting on. You knew they were chairs, right? And our brain does this about everything. Quick, automatic, and unconscious associations that we're not even aware are occurring. So if you see this picture of a doctor, what's your brain doing when you're not aware of it? It is calling up other concepts that are typically associated with doctor, and it is completely irrelevant whether you believe these associations. Your brain learns them, so that when you see a doctor, these unconscious associations are brought to the forefront of your brain, and the reason it matters is because it then influences you in ways you are unaware of and unable to control unless you're conscious of it. Here's another example. If I were to ask you, who's the felon, and you didn't know who they were, right? Your answer would be influenced by the associations that you make. Here's another example. Social psychologists use something called subliminal priming. All that means is they will flash a photo so quickly on a computer screen that you're unaware that you've seen a photo at all. But the reason they do this is, again, to bring to the forefront of your memory, quickly, automatically, and unconsciously, everything that you associate with the picture that you're not even consciously aware that you've seen. Subliminal priming. So if you were primed with this photo and then you were asked to complete this word fragment, the way you completed it would be influenced by the photo that you didn't even realize you'd seen. So raise your hand if you think the way you evaluate me, if you don't know me, the way that you evaluate me will be influenced by whether you're drinking a warm beverage or a cold one. Raise your hand if you think you'll be influenced by that. Good for you. The 3 people here are absolutely right. The rest of you are all wrong, but I hope by the end you'll realize why they're right here in the front. As I mentioned to you, you are influenced quickly, automatically, and unconsciously by things present in the environment. So if you're holding something warm, what your brain is doing is bringing everything that it has associated with warmth to the forefront of your minds, and then it influences you. So what do you associate with warmth? A warm personality. So you are much more likely to like me. So before you fill out the evals, please, right, drink coffee right now, actually, because you'll be influenced by it. And once again, these unconscious associations influence you when the situation is ambiguous, when you don't know people that well, when you're trying to figure out what's going on. So everything I'm talking about in terms of unconscious bias, what I'm talking about are the influences when things are ambiguous, when you don't have full information. How many of you have read this book, Thinking Fast and Slow? I encourage all of you to read this book. What I'm talking about is a small subset of the way that our brains work, but Thinking Fast and Slow is part of a broader system that describes the way that our brains work and the way that we're influenced and others are influenced. This is something that can help you in your trials. Just like with what I talked about with the coffee and the water, think about the jury. They're usually served water. Maybe you want them to be served cold water when the officer is on the stand, but warm coffee if your client's on the stand. But these things matter. What Daniel Kahneman talks about is System 1 and System 2. System 1 is what I'm talking about, the things that work quickly, automatically, and unconsciously when we're not aware of it. System 2 is what we typically think of when we think about the way our brains work. It's conscious, it's slow, it's deliberate. We think we're often in System 2, but System 1, this quick, automatic, and unconscious work that our brain is doing in the background, influences us in almost everything we do. I'm going to share one quick thing unrelated to race called anchoring, which is an example, once again, of the way our brains work. If you're in the middle of a plea bargain, what anchoring tells us is if you throw out an arbitrary number and you're the first person to throw out that number, where you end up will be influenced by the first number people have heard. Think about the listing for a home, right? When you negotiate a home price, if you start with the listing price, the ending price is going to be somewhere around the listing price. This is a psychological phenomena called anchoring, and it influences all of us. If you were the first person to throw out a number, whatever the final number is will be influenced by the number that was first heard. So be the first. And now that you know about anchoring, ignore any other number that someone else would bring up before you. Okay, implicit bias. It refers to what I've just been talking about, our automatic, unconscious associations that we make about everything. And how does it work? So when we talk about unconscious bias, whether it's racial bias or gender bias or age bias, the first thing that happens is you categorize people within milliseconds. And in this country, we have learned that one of the most important characterizations is race. So within milliseconds, what your unconscious brain is doing is profiling me. We all profile unconsciously. So I want to put your brains at ease because I'm telling you what your brain is doing is you're trying to profile me. Your brain is trying to figure out what race is she. So I'm going to tell you I am Black and I'm Korean, but that's not going to help your unconscious brain because then what your unconscious brain does is it applies attributes to the category. It applies stereotypes, which are beliefs about groups, and attitudes, either positive or negative about groups. That's why I said it wouldn't help you, because the beliefs and attitudes about Asians are different from the beliefs and attitudes about Blacks, right? So your brain is really confused, but that's what your unconscious brain is doing. So where do these beliefs and attitudes come from? Because the important part is you don't have to believe the attitudes and beliefs that you're going to apply to me or anyone else. Again, your brain does it quickly, automatically, and unconsciously. Artificial intelligence, many of you may know, this is from an article in 2016 in The Guardian, many of you may know that machines are learning language. They want to teach machines to speak and understand language, and these machines develop algorithms to do that. So one artificial intelligence machine is fed all of the news from Google News. All of it, so it can start developing algorithms to understand language. And guess what happens? What they found is that artificial intelligence is developing the same unconscious racial, gender, and age biases that all of us have. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because some of you will be sitting there as I speak today thinking, I don't have those biases. Are you calling me a racist? How dare you say that to me? And what I'm saying to you is, I'm not calling you a racist. I'm saying, simply by virtue of living in this culture, it is the rare person who doesn't have unconscious racial biases, the ones I'm going to talk about in a moment. Not only that, we learn them when we try to do Google searches. This is what the autofill function used to do when you would type in, does Islam, or are Jews? Or if you would use the search function for photos, it would tag black men as gorillas, right? We learn it by things like this. How about this news article from The Guardian? Black St. Louis police officer shot white colleague. What is this story about? What is this story about? What? It's a story about a black St. Louis police officer who shoots a white colleague. Isn't that what you would think? By reading the title? It's actually about a white officer who shot his black colleague. That's what this story is about, right? But if you're not reading the story and you're just looking at things like this is how we develop these unconscious associations. It's just through exposure. It doesn't have anything to do with your conscious beliefs. We call it implicit, just a fancy word for unconscious. We call it bias because it influences us. And bias, importantly, can be both positive and negative. So when we talk about racial bias, we often think about negative treatment of certain social groups. But bias, as I'll talk about in a moment, also influences us more positively. We treat certain groups better than other groups, and that also causes racial bias. And these unconscious associations strengthen over time. The more we practice them, the stronger they are and the more influenced we are. So these unconscious biases that we're going to talk about today influence everything. You don't have to read these studies to know the direction of the influence because you know what the stereotypes and attitudes are in our culture. We prefer white. We treat white better than black. We prefer men over women, young over old, skinny over overweight, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these biases have been tested. Let me give you one example in the gender context, and then I'll start talking about race. But at this point, because you know how our brains work, when I begin to talk about unconscious racial bias, you shouldn't be surprised, because it's just the way that our brains work. Okay, how many of you here, any of you, classical music fans? Just a few of you. So what you might know about orchestras across the country is there was a time when most of the musicians were men. And when you would talk to the conductors and managers and ask them, why don't you have more women musicians? You all know what they said. It's what we typically hear. They're just not as good. We can't find qualified women, right? Isn't that what we always hear? So there were some conductors who said, that's not true, I don't believe it. So they began to work with social psychologists to figure out why there was this gender disparity, which is something that I'm going to suggest we should all be doing. When you look at your offices, if you don't have gender or racial disparity, the answer is not, oh, we just can't find that right person. The answer is something is wrong and we should do something about it, just like the conductors and managers here did. And this is something I'm going to repeat throughout because none of you should feel defensive for having unconscious racial biases. I have them. The reason I started this whole thing is because I took the implicit association test that I'll talk to you about in a moment. And when I took that test, I preferred men over women, light skin over dark skin, white over black. I had all of the unconscious biases that most of us have, and I was appalled, and I wanted to figure out why, and that's why I started doing this research. So we're not culpable for having implicit bias. We are culpable for not doing anything about it. So the conductors here, they did something about it. They didn't believe that women weren't as qualified, and so what they did is they started to have people audition behind a screen. because how you evaluate music is subjective, right? It's ambiguous. It can be influenced by what's going on in our unconscious. And so when they had people audition behind a screen, you know what happened. More women were hired. In fact, the number of women increased by 25 to 46%. And then some orchestras went further and they had people take off their shoes. Why? The high heels, right? The click, click, click would make you think woman, even if you weren't thinking it consciously, and that influenced how you heard the music. So the number of women hired by orchestras went up by an additional 10%. Okay, so that was just background. Now we're getting to the main event, right? Implicit racial bias. What I want to do first is share some studies related to implicit bias, and then I'll talk about some ways of safeguarding against them. I'm going to skip some of these slides as I go through it because I have too many and in the interest of time. But this is the most important point that I want all of you to keep in mind. I think of myself as the most egalitarian person that exists. And I just told you, I have these biases too. And if we have time, I'll talk about an embarrassing incident that happened to me that demonstrated to my acting on my unconscious bias, but I'm going to skip that for now. Okay, so I mentioned the implicit association test, the IAT. How many of you have taken that? Oh, I'm so happy to see so many of you have taken this test. And so many of you probably found that you had some. Some of you don't, based on this test, but most of us do. And by the way, this is not the only way to test unconscious bias, and I'll be talking about some other ways as we go forward. But for those who've both taken it or haven't taken it, this is a useful exercise, what I'm about to show you why the IAT is able to measure our unconscious bias, and also to show a little bit, again, about how your brains work in ways you're unaware of. But I will need your participation. So I told you earlier that you can't help but read, but now I'm going to ask you not to read. I'm going to ask you to look at the color but ignore the words. And I want you to shout out as quickly as possible the color, but not the words. As quickly as possible while avoiding error. So I'll do the first one with you. Shout out the color, not the word. Ready? Go. Red. Yellow, blue, green, brown. Okay, a little bit louder, please. Go. Red, yellow, blue, green, brown. Great. Blue. Fantastic. Red, yellow, blue, green, brown. You guys are doing great. Blue, brown, red, yellow, green. Fantastic. Yep. Just give up. Stop. Stop. I don't need to hear anymore. Okay. So this is known as the Stroop test. Social psychologists use this all the time to figure out how closely are two things associated. Right? And so when the color and the word match, we're quick. When the color and the word don't match, your quote-unquote reaction time is a little bit slower because it doesn't match. So the implicit association test uses this insight. And what it does, instead of colors and words, it uses faces and positive and negative words. So for those of you who haven't taken it, you sit in front of a computer screen, you use the I key and the E key on your computer keyboard. And during one of the trials, it'll say, if you see a black face, hit the E key as quickly as possible while avoiding error. If you see the white face, hit the I key. A positive word, hit the E key. A negative word, hit the I key. And you're just going to do this as quickly as possible while avoiding error. Millions of people have taken the IAT, and what they have found is that when it's stereotype inconsistent, the black face and the positive word are assigned to the same hand, we stutter a bit. We're slower, just like when the word and the color doesn't match, because we are taught that positive things and black individuals are not closely related. This is just one measure of our unconscious bias. When it's stereotype consistent, we're fast. When the white face and the positive words are assigned to the same key. Implicit bias influences all professions, but that's not a surprise because it influences all of us because we're human. But who cares about unconscious bias? It might just be a fun thing to talk about if it didn't have real-world effects. So let me take a moment to just discuss a few studies demonstrating these effects, and then, as I said, I'm going to end by talking about some ways we can safeguard against it. Okay, one way it can influence us is the interpretation of ambiguous behaviors. And again, I'll say this again, these unconscious biases influence us in ambiguous situations, when we don't have much information, when we're acting quickly, and we're not paying attention. So in this particular study, social psychologists brought subjects into the lab, and then they lied to them, because that's what social psychologists do, right? Okay. So they said to the subjects, you're going to be watching a video of a conversation that's happening in the next room. And after you're done watching this video of this conversation, we'll have some questions to ask. But it wasn't really a video of people talking in the next room. Instead, it was a pre-recorded video made by actors following a script. And during this conversation, one of the individuals shoved the other, and then the video ended. And the subjects had the option of rating that shove, rating it as violent and aggressive on the one hand, or playful and dramatic on the other. Now, on these videos, they had manipulated the race of the two men in the video. So when both of the individuals were white, only 13% rated that ambiguous shove as being violent and aggressive. But when both were black, that identical shove was rated as violent and aggressive by 69% of the subjects. Then they did interracial pairings. When the white individual was the aggressor and the black individual was the victim, only 17% rated that shove as violent and aggressive. But when the black individual was the aggressor and the white individual was the victim, the number went up from 17% to 75%, who rated the identical shove as being violent and aggressive. And the researchers concluded that it was our stereotypes of young black men as being violent and aggressive and dangerous that influenced the way the subjects rated this ambiguous behavior. There are studies involving police and probation officers and the evaluation of ambiguous behaviors and how much punishment they should receive. And once again, the social psychologists found that unconscious bias influenced in exactly the same way I just described how police and probation officers rate ambiguous behaviors that they read about or that they actually see. There was a recent study that demonstrated when you have a black man and a white man who are the same in in every single way except for their skin color, the black individual was rated larger, stronger, more muscular, more capable of causing harm. And the subject said, when it came to police violence, the police were more justified in using violence against the identical black man versus the white man. There's another study done by Jennifer Eberhard, and it deals with how stereotypically black you look. What do I mean by that? They had photos, and they had people rate the photos of men as being more black or less black. More black meant darker skin, wider nose, thicker lips. And what they found in death penalty cases is that black defendants accused of killing white victims were more likely to receive the death penalty if they had more Afrocentric features. And they have not found this just in the death penalty context, but also in the drug sentencing context. Longer sentences just by your features. So I'm talking about negative anti-black bias, but let me talk about the flip side of that, which is positive pro-white bias. Implicit or unconscious white favoritism. Whites are more likely to be viewed as innocent. We have more positive attitudes and positive stereotypes about whites. So how does this play out? Let me talk about one study. In this study, you're sitting in front of a computer screen and you are subliminally primed with photos. Remember, you're seeing a photo so quickly you're not consciously aware you have seen anything. It's either of a black face, a white face, or the control group, no face at all. Then you were shown a fuzzy photo, and you were asked to stop this photo when you were able to recognize it. How many frames does it take to recognize either a crime-relevant object like handcuffs and knives, or something totally unrelated to crime like a teacup? And the researchers hypothesized that if you saw the black face, remember what's happening? What your brain is doing is bringing to the forefront of your minds things that you unconsciously associate with black faces. So they thought if you unconsciously saw the black face, you are quicker to identify crime-related objects. You are slower to identify crime-related objects if you saw a white face below the level of conscious awareness, because whites are not associated with criminality. If you saw no face at all, the control group, it shouldn't matter. The number of frames it took for you to identify the crime-related object would be the same. So let me show you what the study found. On the left-hand axis, the vertical axis, is the number of frames it took to recognize the crime or crime-irrelevant object. When you didn't see any face at all, and it's a teacup, it took about 23 frames. When it was a teacup and you saw the black face, it took 23 frames, and you saw the white face, it took about 23 frames. The difference in the bar size were statistically insignificant. And this is what the researchers expected. When you didn't see a face at all and now you see a gun, it still takes 23 frames. It's what you would expect. When you saw the black face, however, it took fewer frames than when you saw the white face to identify weapons. Why? Once again, unconsciously, we don't associate whites with guilt. The same is shown in what's called shooter bias studies by the police. Exactly the same thing happens. They are slower to identify weapons when in the hands of whites versus when in the hands of blacks. This unconscious association between blacks and criminality also applied to children as young as 5 years old. When they tested the same study I gave you, but this time they showed black children quicker to identify weapons. If it's a white child, slower to identify weapons. These unconscious biases also influence our memories. So in one particular study, they had mock jurors read a scenario about William, i.e. white, or Tyrone, i.e. black. And then after reading the scenario, they were distracted for just 15 minutes. And then they were asked questions about the scenario they had just read. When they read about Tyrone, they correctly remembered more aggressive details, but they forgot more of the aggressive details when they read about William. And then they actually made aggressive details up. And I'm not saying they did this on purpose, right? Our brains are not pristine, our memories are not pristine. They are influenced by things like unconscious racial bias. Let me tell you about another study related to evidence evaluation. Here, there was a mock, the subjects were told there was a robbery. They were shown photos from the robbery, but the most important photo was this. Either you saw a defendant with a white-skinned forearm, or you saw a defendant with a black-skinned forearm. This was the important photo. They were trying to figure out how our unconscious minds would then influence the way they interpreted ambiguous evidence, evidence that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. But once they saw this evidence, they asked the jurors, how probative of guilt is this evidence? And it's things like the defendant recently lost his job. They identified the defendant's voice. The defendant used to work at this mini-mart. When they saw the white-skinned forearm, they said, the jurors, this evidence is less probative of guilt. When they saw the black-skinned forearm, this evidence is more probative of guilt, and they were more likely to convict the black defendant. Implicit bias can also influence our behaviors. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of this except to say this. Unconscious racial bias can cause people during interactions to sit further away, to have more unfriendly body language, to end the interaction earlier, and to make more speech errors. In fact, unconscious racial bias makes us more likely to view ambiguous facial expressions as being more hostile and unfriendly and as lasting longer on a black face versus on a white face. And you can imagine how this can influence your own interviews with clients and the interviews that police officers have with our clients and probation officers too. And what's worse about this is the self-fulfilling prophecy effect, because you don't even realize that you're acting this way, but when you act this way, your behaviors are mirrored back to you. But what you see is the unfriendliness or the aggression from the person you're talking to without realizing that you may have started it, the self-fulfilling prophecy effect. This can negatively influence interactions in obvious ways. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about racial anxiety, but I think it's important to mention, because racial anxiety can also cause negative interactions. So what do I mean by racial anxiety? And if you're interested in racial anxiety, I have an article that I recently wrote with Rachel Godsill that talks about this in great detail, especially in how it can influence police officers. So what's racial anxiety? If you're a person of color and you're interacting, the racial anxiety is all about our interactions that are interracial. So as a person of color, if I'm interacting with someone white who I don't know, I am anxious. I'm anxious because I'm worried that you might say or do something, treat me in a hostile way or in a distant way because of my race. So I become anxious. And what happens when you're anxious? You know what happens when you're anxious. You can't think clearly. You just want to get out of that situation. You're uncomfortable. Your body language is closed off. And then we have that self-fulfilling prophecy effect. But if you're white interacting with me, you're also suffering from racial anxiety because you're worried that you might say something that I will think is racist when you're not. Right? And so you become anxious and you want to end the interaction earlier, and you have this negative body language, and so the entire interaction can be incredibly uncomfortable, even when both of us really do want to interact with each other. And this causes exactly what I just told you about. Shorter interactions, more negative facial expressions, right? More negative body language, and you just leave. You end the interaction. And in fact, I'll tell you this, the studies with whites and racial anxiety show sometimes that the bigot sometimes is far more comfortable in that interaction with me than the egalitarian individual. Because the bigot could care less what I think about him, versus the consciously egalitarian individual really worries about what I think and then becomes far more anxious. It works the opposite way too, but the reason I bring this up is just knowing that racial anxiety can influence you can help reduce that anxiety and facilitate better interactions, not only with each other, but with our clients. And so I'll talk some about this at the end. There are some interventions for this too, but I at least wanted to raise this issue before I go on. I'm going to skip this video, actually. I'll mention one more thing about racial anxiety because it's really true, and it can also influence the interactions that you really do need to have to reduce unconscious bias, right? One of the ways to reduce unconscious racial bias is to have more positive interactions with people who are different from you, and yet it is difficult sometimes to do that because of racial anxiety. And one of the effects of racial anxiety is this. When you're having an interracial interaction, part of what your brain is saying is, don't say that. Don't say, if she's Asian, that, do you like kimchi? Like, don't talk about where her family comes, like, don't do that. But the more you attempt to suppress a thought, the more likely it is that you will have that thought. That's the way our brains work. If I ask you right now not to think about, for the next minute or two, a pink elephant, If you really tried to do that, not think about a pink elephant, what's your brain doing? It's bringing up pink elephants so it can suppress pink elephants. And by bringing it up, it makes it more likely you're going to think about it. And the same thing occurs when you want to not say something. Okay, so I've talked about a little bit about racial anxiety, a lot about implicit racial bias, and it, again, influences everyone at discretionary decision-making points. It's when you're dealing quickly with limited information that your brain will bring up unconscious associations that will influence you. So I want to talk about the ways in which we can attempt to reduce the influence of these unconscious biases. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not culpable for having them. But we are culpable for not doing the things that we know can help reduce them. So let me end by talking about some of those things. It's important first to realize what increases our use of these unconscious associations. Just in case you can't see it in the back: stress, overload, time pressure, multitasking, exercising discretion, having ambiguous criteria or qualifications, and incomplete data. Because when you're stressed, you're not paying attention. When you're time consumed, you're not paying attention. When you don't have enough information, your brain fills in the blanks, just like where I started with the triangles and the circles. That's just the way our brains work. Our brains are efficient information processors. What doesn't work? Having good intentions is important because you'll do what's necessary, but it's not enough. It's not enough to just sit here and say, now I know. Now I'm just not going to do it anymore. That's good intentions, great, insufficient. Suppression and avoidance. By that I mean, I'm colorblind. I don't see color, right? If you're actually colorblind, then of course. But if you're not, there are actually studies of this, by the way, right? Many white people pretend to be colorblind because they think to see color means that you're racist. It doesn't. It really doesn't. We all see color. And here's the other thing that happens that relates to racial anxiety. Because you're so anxious about describing someone by color that when you say, oh, he's black, right? You kind of whisper it, you're a little uncomfortable, your face contorts. That's racial anxiety because you're worried about how the person you're talking to is going to judge you. It is not racist to notice race. And in fact, you can't deal with the influence of unconscious racial bias if you don't talk about race. You must, if you care. I'll just give you an example of a jury trial. A jury trial that involved a black defendant or a white defendant hitting his pregnant girlfriend, knocking her to the ground. Then they had a jury decide guilty or not guilty. Even though the defendant was either black or white, when race was not made salient, they were more likely, the jury, to convict the black defendant in the identical case. They were more likely to view the prosecutor's case as being stronger against the black defendant. The defense case against the black defendant was weaker than the case against the white defendant. The black defendant was more aggressive. The white defendant was more honest and moral. That's when people pretended that race didn't matter. But when the jury was told that race did matter, when it was made salient, I should say, all of these differences in the way the white defendant and the black defendant were treated disappeared. The social psychologists hypothesized that it's because when you are made aware that race might influence you, you become more careful. You gather more information. And when you do that, as I mentioned, these biases are less likely to influence you. Self-perceived objectivity, the way that I used to think of myself as being the most egalitarian person ever. If you are sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, all this stuff influences other people, but I'm so egalitarian, it is not me. You probably are the worst. Just being honest, there are studies of this too. The more objective you think you are, the more likely you are to be influenced by these biases. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking, yeah, but not me. And I would venture to say yes, especially you. 2 ways that we can overcome these biases. One, I think, is debiasing. Many of us don't have you can actually teach yourself not to have these unconscious biases, but that's really difficult. It's like stopping smoking, not drinking, or losing weight, like all of the habits. It's really a habit. And when we're confronted every day by these negative associations about people of color and positive associations about people who are white, it is really hard not to have them. So I want to spend more time talking about how we can put systems in place, the things that we can do to not change the unconscious bias, but rather to safeguard against them. So I'm going to mix the two, the debiasing and the bias override together, and I'm almost done. But the first thing I want to say is start with yes. What do I mean by starting with yes? When we give these talks to groups of people all the time, someone will raise their hand and they'll say, gosh, that's so interesting, but that will never work here. My judges will never do that. My jurisdiction is different than your jurisdiction. So what you're doing is you're starting from no. What I'm saying is start from yes. And I just want to give you an example of a prosecutor. And I know we can do better than the prosecutors do, but I want to tell you about a prosecutor who started with yes. And this is a white prosecutor from Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Incredibly, explicitly biased place. He asked me and my colleague to go do an all-day training in his office because he's white, 60 years old. He just voted for Trump, by the way. This is the guy that I'm talking about. We came down to do an all-day training with him last year. And he said, I had just read a book called Slavery by Another Name by Harold Blackman. Highly recommend this book. And it changed his worldview. All of a sudden, he understood what members of his black community were saying when they would criticize his office, and he wanted to do better. We did an all-day training with him, and after that, we left. A year later, we get in contact with him, as we do with so many other places where we do these trainings. He has put some of the things I'm going to talk about in place in his office. He's doing the things that we said you should do. And not only that, this white Republican Trump-voting prosecutor also said, I want one of you to come and be embedded in my office. I want you to watch as we read cases and make charging decisions because we want to know what else can we do to reduce the influence of these unconscious biases on our judgments and behaviors. And then I did a training with my same colleague with North Carolina judges in that same area. And what the judges said to us is, we don't know what you did, but this office is different today than it was before. So start with yes. I don't want to hear, I can't do this. Yes, you can if you have the guts to do it. Yes, you can do it. And you're going to hear from Kiana about the amazing things that are going on in Seattle that she's done in her cases, and that Jeff and I, when we worked with a group of federal district court judges in Seattle, Washington, to create jury instructions and a video on implicit bias, right? Working with the prosecutor, the U.S. Attorney's Office there. Yes, you can do it if you're committed, and yes, you are culpable if you don't. Okay, so the first thing is awareness. Awareness helps. Awareness that unconscious bias can influence you can actually help you reduce them because hopefully it'll make you more careful. But let me just show you the final quick video of this presentation. And what it's going to ask you to do, in case you can't hear it, is, and can you turn the lights down, please? Count the number of passes that the team in white makes. Pay very close attention. If you've seen this video before, please do not react. Count the number, and don't yell out the number of passes. Okay.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
How many?
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So, awareness matters. Now you are all aware of the ways that implicit racial bias can influence you. Awareness matters. So what are some specific things that you can do? Here's one thing you can do individually. Doubt your objectivity. When you're thinking about, should I go to trial in this case? Is this a good sentencing recommendation? Doubt your objectivity. Sometimes you can do this by race switching. What if this defendant were of a different race? Assign challengers. Assign someone in your office, and their role is to challenge every discretionary decision you make. This will force you to justify those decisions, to get more information, to slow down. These things can help you be more aware and reduce the influence on your behaviors, judgments, and perceptions. And it's not just you slow down, it's slow everyone down. I was just having a conversation yesterday. I don't know if I'll out you or not, Colette, right? About the importance of slowing down. And she'll talk a lot more about this later. Why are we in such a rush? Right? When you're sitting in a courtroom and the judge is trying to rush you, why are you in such a rush? You need someone at the head of your office like Bob. Right? Bob supported us. Bob would never let us, Bob Berukowitz, would never let the attorneys in his office simply plead our clients guilty because the judge is rushing us. Are you kidding me? He would probably try to fire us, right? What are you in a rush for? Why are you doing this job? If you're not going to slow down, slow the system down, because you know what? Though we often say we're busy, we make time for the things that we consider to be important. And so when the judge is rushing you, you just say no. You just say, hold me in contempt then, Your Honor, which is what Bob taught us to do. Send us to jail then, because we will be ineffective if you force us to hurry up now. Why do we do that? We are the ones who should be slowing the system down. Articulate reasons for the decisions that you are making. Don't just do it blindly, automatically, when you get a drug case. Oh yeah, I know what this drug case is about. This is worth a year, right? That's what many of us do because we're so rushed and so busy. You're culpable if you do that. Because what will happen is these biases will influence you. Improve the conditions of decision making. This is exactly sort of the same thing I'm talking about. When you're making decisions, don't make them when you're busy. Don't make them when you're overwhelmed and tired and potentially angry, right? Because now you know these biases will influence you. One way, because often we are influenced in ways that we are unaware of. We make decisions that are different in similar cases, but we don't know that we are. And often, studies show, we change the criteria we use to make decisions to reach the one that feels right. That's just what we do. And so we should create checklists instead. Jeff Adachi of the San Francisco Public Defender's Office has done a lot with checklists. If you're looking for checklists on different cases, look at his work. Jeff Adachi, the San Francisco Public Defender. If you have checklists, it will slow you down because you have to think about each of the criteria you are using. You have to think about, am I treating this case differently from another? And I'm not saying you can't. What I am saying is, if you do it consciously. Have the reasons for why one person is treated differently than another. Don't allow your unconscious biases to cause differences in the way we treat people. Commit to the evaluation criteria you're going to use before you make those decisions. This is just what I'm talking about. We choose the person that we like when we do interviews without even realizing it, even though they may not be the best candidate. We choose the people, we spend more time with clients that we like more, that are easier, we think, to talk to than those that we think are, quote unquote, difficult. And yet those difficult clients might be difficult because of racial anxiety and not trusting you. So if you think about the things you're going to do before you do them, the actions you're going to take before they happen, it can help you reduce the influence of these biases on your behaviors and judgments. I mentioned positive interracial contact and the ways that it can be difficult because of racial anxiety. So before I end, let me quickly say a couple things that can help you reduce the racial anxiety that you feel. One is recognizing the anxiety when you feel it. That prevents it from spiraling out of control. Say, oh, I recognize this. This is just anxiety. I can deal with that, instead of letting it spiral out of control. The second, then, is to create a script. And I really mean a script. What are you going to do and say in a situation you know will raise your racial anxiety? So I'll give you an example. Police departments are doing this now, too. I'll just give you an example of the importance of the script and the order of the script. So one of the ways, here's an example of a black parent going to visit the teacher at a parent-teacher conference. And it's the teacher, the white teacher, who suffered from racial anxiety. And what the teacher said to the black parent is, gosh, your child is doing so well. He's so smart, right? He's doing well in school, etc. And what ended up happening is the black parents thought, are you saying this to me because you are surprised that my black child is doing well in school? Right? Totally understandable from both sides. The teacher wasn't saying it because it was a black child. This is what the teacher always said. And so the new script that the teacher has to reduce her racial anxiety is, the first time she meets any parent, she says, when I do these parent-teacher conferences, the first thing I talk about are all the great things that your child is doing. The second thing I talk about with every parent are the things that could improve. And then the third thing that happens is I'll take your questions. That was her script. The order mattered, and it reduced racial anxiety on both sides. So you can think of ways to do this when you're going to go see a client, when you're going to have a conversation with the judge, or in any type of situation where you think racial anxiety might influence you. And then you can have more positive interracial contacts. Reminders before you're going to make discretionary decisions. Let's say you're sitting at your desk with a pile of cases that you have, and now you got to come up with sentencing, or write your sentencing memo. How creative are you going to be in those sentencing memos, for instance, or make an argument before the judge? If you remind yourself before you start making these discretionary decisions that you might be influenced by unconscious bias, it will help you slow down, gather more information, and be more careful. There are companies that do this now. Before performance evaluations, they send out an email to the entire office saying, remember, studies demonstrate that these performance evaluations are affected by race and gender. Be careful when you do your performance evaluations. Blind judging. If you can think of circumstances to do blind judging, the way that the orchestras did with the women that I talked about in the beginning. There's a judge in Iowa, Judge Mark Bennett, that you might know, that does blind judging when he's issuing his initial sentencing recommendation. He makes sure that all the information he gets, including from the probation officer, does not have any information about race in it. Environmental cues. Your screensaver, this is part of debiasing. If you come back from court and all of your clients were black, and they're all pleading guilty, and now, or they're not, but you come back just by virtue of being in a courtroom where all of the defendants are people of color, you are practicing the negative associations. You just are. Strengthening unconscious racial bias, even if you don't mean to. That means when you get back to the office and you're about to make a discretionary decision, don't make it right away. Because these biases are now at the forefront of your mind. Take a break. Look at positive images of people of color that you respect and that you like to personally debias yourself. Take some time. These are ways you can debias yourself in the very short term. Avoid ambiguity. I know that's hard because with ambiguity, you're going to fill up the missing pieces consistent with stereotypes. So gather more information. Count. All that means is gather data. The only way you know whether you're influenced by these unconscious biases, because they are unconscious, is to gather data. The only way you know if your office is treating people differently based on race is data. This is what that prosecutor in North Carolina is doing. Every single one of his attorneys and their entire office are gathering data so they can figure out where the problems are. Creating accountability too. Once you gather the data, you have to explain the data. Because you might have racially disparate data, but you have good reasons for it, or you don't. And if you know you have to explain your decisions, what does that do? It makes you more careful. Creating diverse teams helps. I already talked about addressing anxiety, so I'm going to skip through all of that. I was going to talk about the things that are going on in Seattle, but I'm not going to do that because I know that that's going to occur later. So where I just want to leave you again is close to where we began. We're all good people here. We are public defenders, criminal defense lawyers, because our heart is in it. We want to do the right thing. We want there to be justice in the justice system, but we are also responsible. We are culpable if we don't do the things that are necessary to do ourselves to reduce the impact of these unconscious biases on our behaviors and judgment. So justice should not be blind. Because if justice is blind, these unconscious biases will cause horrible racial disparities. So thank you very much for your attention.